It was meant to be a simple winter afternoon. Families wrapped against the cold, children pulling at gloved hands, young men eager to show off on the ice, and thousands of spectators lining the banks of the ornamental lake in Regent's Park, watching the world glide by. But on the 15th of January, 1867, what began as laughter and the scrape of blades across frozen water would end in screaming, chaos, and death. In less than a few terrifying minutes, the ice gave way, and 40 people would never make it home. London in winter, setting the scene. London in January of 1867 was a city held in the grip of an exceptional cold. Normally, the surrounding seas kept temperatures from dropping too sharply or staying low for long. England was accustomed to damp gray winters, to fog rolling off the Thames, and frost that disappeared by mid-morning. But that winter was different. The cold arrived, and it stayed. Day after day, night after night, temperatures refused to lift. Water that would ordinarily remain sluggish and dark locked itself into silence. For a city of nearly 3 million people, this kind of cold was both a hardship and a spectacle. Coal fires burned harder in the hearths of those who could afford them. The poor huddled in overcrowded rooms, sharing warmth out of necessity. But out in the parks, something else was happening entirely. The frozen water was drawing people out, not cautiously or reluctantly, but eagerly, with excitement, as though the frost had issued a personal invitation. Regent's Park sat in the northern part of the city, a grand open space designed in the early 19th century as part of a sweeping vision for London's expansion. Its ornamental lake, a broad, shallow stretch of water shaped by careful landscaping, had become one of the park's most beloved features. In summer, it was pleasant to walk beside. In a hard winter, it became something else altogether. It became a stage. By mid-January of 1867, that lake had frozen solid, or so it appeared. And word had spread quickly, as it always did in a city hungry for affordable winter entertainment. The ice was holding. Come and see. Come and skate. Skating in the Victorian age. To understand why so many people were on that ice, you have to understand what skating meant in Victorian England. It was not simply a pastime. It was a performance, a social occasion, and one of the few activities that drew different classes of society into the same open space, at least temporarily. Skating in this period was spectacle as much as recreation. Those with skill could be admired. New skates, often elaborate and expensive, could be shown off to the crowd. Young men demonstrated their confidence in long sweeping arcs. Women, heavily dressed in thick coats and layered skirts, moved with careful elegance. Friendships unfolded on the ice. Flirtations, too. For working men and women who spent their weeks indoors at counters, benches, and factory floors, a frozen lake offered something rare and wonderful. Open air, movement, and the kind of exhilarating cold that made the blood feel alive. Vendors gathered at the edges of popular skating spots, selling hot chestnuts, pastime, and drinks to the crowds. Spectators lined the banks in their hundreds, leaning forward to watch particular figures, calling out to friends, and simply enjoying the visual theater of a frozen city making use of its landscape. Children ran from adult supervision to steal their own few minutes on the ice. Older visitors stood at the edges and remembered their own younger winters. Newspaper accounts from the period often described the atmosphere at a well-frozen lake as lively and confident. The ice had drawn a crowd, and the crowd itself had become part of the attraction. That confidence, warm and collective, and entirely understandable, was also precisely what made what happened next so devastating. The ice and its hidden danger. Lake ice is one of nature's most deceptive surfaces. To the eye, it appears uniform. Either it is there or it is not. Either it holds or it does not. The truth is far more complicated and far more dangerous. Ice does not form evenly across a body of water. It builds in layers, each shaped by the temperature of the preceding night, the movement of water beneath, the presence of snowfall on top, and the location of underwater springs or currents that keep certain spots marginally warmer than others. A cold, still night might add a reassuring inch of new ice to the surface. A slightly milder afternoon, or a patch of ground where water moves below, can hollow it out from underneath without leaving a single visible crack. Snow creates its own complications. When it settles on ice, it acts as insulation, slowing further freezing. It can also create a porous, weakened layer within the ice itself, one that looks solid but carries far less weight than it appears capable of supporting. And in a shallow, ornamental lake, fed by uncertain underground drainage, these invisible variables multiply. What most people standing on a frozen lake see is a flat white surface that held their weight last time and appears to be doing so again. What they cannot see is the internal structure of the ice, its varying thickness across the bed, the places where it is 4 inches deep and the places where it is barely 2 inches. There is no reliable way to assess this with the naked eye. In 1867, there was no system in place to measure it, post warnings, or prevent access to a surface that could not honestly declare itself safe. The ornamental lake in Regent's Park had another complicating factor. In places, the water beneath was deep enough that a person breaking through would immediately be submerged. Reaching the bottom was not a certainty. And reaching the surface again, in freezing water, dressed in the heavy woolen clothing of the Victorian era, was far from guaranteed. The warning that was not heeded. On the 14th of January, 1867, the ice offered a warning. It was not subtle. The surface cracked, and 21 people plunged through into the freezing water below. All 21 were rescued, shaken, soaked, and deeply frightened, but alive. They were hauled from the water by park keepers, constables, and members of the public who rushed to the edges and thrust out whatever they could find. Branches, ropes, and hands reached across the broken surface, and the people in the water were pulled clear. It was a harrowing experience for everyone involved. In the immediate aftermath, it drew significant attention. The newspapers noted it. The crowds talked about it. For a brief moment, there was alarm. But the alarm carried within it a quietly disastrous lesson. The system had worked. People fell in, and people were saved. No one died. And by the next morning, the break in the ice had frozen over again. The surface appeared restored. What had been a dangerous gap was now just another patch of white. What the crowd took from the 14th of January was not caution. It was reassurance. The ice could fail, and people could be rescued. The worst had been tested, and the worst had been survived. And so, on the 15th of January, they came back. Not fewer of them, but more. Word had spread. The ice was dramatic. The ice was exciting. The ice was, apparently, manageable. It was one of the most tragically human conclusions imaginable. The near miss had been processed not as a reason to stay away, but as evidence that everything would be all right. The 14th of January had been a warning dressed in the clothing of a lucky escape, and almost no one read it correctly. The 15th of January, the final hours before collapse. The morning of Tuesday, the 15th of January, 1867, broke cold and clear. By midday, Regent's Park was already drawing visitors. By early afternoon, the lake had become what newspaper accounts would later describe as one of the most popular sights in the city. Several hundred skaters were out on the ice at once. Thousands more lined the banks. The atmosphere was everything a Victorian winter afternoon was supposed to be. Laughter carried across the frozen surface. Children darted between slower adults. Couples moved carefully together in the cold. Vendors worked the edges of the crowd. Further from the banks, where the ice seemed most open and least crowded, some skaters pushed further out, finding space to gather speed. But beneath all of that warmth and noise, the ice was already compromised. The previous day's break had weakened sections of the surface in ways that could not be seen. The overnight refreezing had been uneven, and now hundreds of bodies were loading weight onto a structure that was, in places, far thinner and far more fragile than anyone standing on it could have known. Certain areas of the lake became natural gathering points. People stopped to talk, to watch friends demonstrate turns and spirals, to catch their breath. Spectators on the banks leaned forward, narrowing the safe margin of solid ground at the edges. The weight was not evenly distributed. In specific zones, it was concentrated in ways the ice was never going to withstand. Nobody noticed. Or if someone noticed, they said nothing. The confidence of the crowd, collective and self-reinforcing, made the idea of danger feel remote. The ice had held yesterday. It was holding now. There was nothing in the scene that looked like a disaster about to happen. But the ice did not care what it looked like. The ice gives way. At roughly 3 in the afternoon, the failure began. It was not, survivors later said, a single dramatic crack that split the air and announced itself clearly. Instead, the ice sagged, fractured in one section, and then, almost immediately, disintegrated across a wide area. One moment there was a crowded frozen lake with skaters, and laughter, and the sound of blades scraping across ice. The next, there was a field of broken slabs, dark water surging between them, and people disappearing into the gaps. A report written in the immediate aftermath captured the scale of it in a single sentence. At least 200 persons were struggling in the water and screaming for help. The water they fell into was only a few degrees above freezing. For anyone who has never experienced sudden cold water immersion, the body's response is violent and immediate. An involuntary gasp drives the lungs to expand sharply, and in open water, that gasp can pull water in. The heart strains under the abrupt shock. Clear thought is replaced by a single, overwhelming physical emergency. The body does not calmly assess the situation. It panics from the inside out. Within minutes, strength begins to desert the muscles. Cold does not just make movement uncomfortable, it makes it impossible. Fingers that should grip the edge of an ice shelf simply cannot close properly. Arms that should be pulling a body clear of the water begin to fail. Legs kick less and less until they stop altogether. For many Victorians, there was the added weight of heavy clothing. Thick coats, woolen dresses, leather boots, and layers of undergarments soaked through in seconds and dragged their wearers downward with a force that no amount of effort could overcome. Many of those who fell in could not swim, even those who could found their skills abandoning them in the chaos. The broken ice shifted and tilted, offering no stable surface to reach for. People who had been standing feet from each other moments before were suddenly separated by heaving slabs and black water. The screaming on the surface and the terrible silence below became the defining sounds of that afternoon. Panic on the ice made everything worse. Those still on solid sections rushed toward the edges, exactly where rescuers needed room to work. New cracks opened beneath running feet. Ground that had been solid became treacherous within seconds. The lake, for the people trapped in it, and the people desperately trying to reach them, had stopped being a park attraction and become something ancient and entirely indifferent to human survival. The rescue. The response from the banks was immediate. It was also extraordinary. Park keepers who had been watching the afternoon skating ran forward without hesitation. Police constables on duty in the park did the same. Ordinary members of the public, men and women who had come to watch or skate and who found themselves suddenly witnesses to catastrophe, did not retreat. They moved toward the water. Branches were snapped from trees and thrust out over the broken surface. Ropes appeared. Ladders were dragged from nearby buildings and pushed flat across the ice, creating improvised bridges over which rescuers could crawl toward the furthest victims without crashing through themselves. Men lay down on the ice to spread their weight, reaching out as far as their bodies allowed toward the faces that surfaced and then disappeared again in the churning dark water. Boats were maneuvered into the gaps that had opened up in the ice. Their occupants hauled people over the sides with hands that were already numb, in water that made every grip uncertain and every movement slower than it needed to be. Some rescuers were pulled partly in as the people they were trying to save lost consciousness and became dead weight. They fought free and tried again. It was desperate, exhausting, and heartbreaking work. Some of those pulled from the water were barely conscious, their lips blue, their bodies rigid with cold. They were hurried away to nearby buildings, wrapped in whatever could be found, and rubbed vigorously back toward warmth and life. Others, the ones who had been under longest or who had swallowed water in that first terrible gasp, did not recover. And through it all, the ice kept shifting. The lake did not settle after the initial collapse. It moved and cracked and settled and cracked again, making every rescue attempt a calculated risk for the people carrying it out. Help arrived too late for some. The water was too deep, the distance too great, or the time already lost beyond any saving. By the time the rescue effort wound down and the chaos on the banks began to resolve itself into a terrible quiet, it was clear that something irreversible had happened. The laughter was gone. The vendors were gone. The skaters were gone. What remained was a broken stretch of dark water, scattered debris, and the long, awful task of counting the missing, the dead, and the search that followed. The days that followed were grim in a particular way that only prolonged uncertainty can produce. The lake, treacherous in its collapse, did not give up what it had taken easily or quickly. As temperatures dropped again each night, the surface refroze over the places where people had gone under. Holes that had been cut for rescue had to be cut again for recovery. Divers descended into water that was murky, bitterly cold, and made more dangerous by the shifting debris of broken ice and the loose sediment stirred up by the previous day's chaos. Bodies were recovered where they could be reached. Others remained beneath the ice for days. Families gathered at the park's edges, scanning faces and dreading recognition. The same hope that had led people to the lake 2 days earlier now kept their relatives standing in the cold, waiting for word, praying that the name they feared hearing would not be the next one announced. Eventually, the numbers were confirmed. 40 people were dead. 39 had drowned. 1 had died from the effects of hypothermia. They came from different parts of London and different walks of life. Workers, youths, a handful of people who had simply finished their afternoon and decided to pass by the lake on their way home. The randomness of who survived and who did not haunted the people who had been there. Some had stood only yards from the worst of the collapse. A few steps in a different direction, a different decision about where to skate or where to watch, had drawn the line between safety and death. The dead were taken to the Marylebone workhouse, where the grim process of identification unfolded amid shock, grief, and the particular silence of people who had run out of hope. It was a scene repeated in far too many London winters to come, but never before on this scale. The inquest and the question of blame. An inquest followed, presided over by the Middlesex coroner Edwin Lancaster. Witness after witness came forward to describe what they had seen: the sudden collapse, the desperate rescues, the terrifying speed with which strength had failed in the water, the moments they had watched someone stop struggling and go still. In the end, the jury returned verdicts of accidental death in all 40 cases. Lancaster told the court there was no evidence to suggest that any person was guilty of culpable negligence. Others had testified that the ice itself had been in an unsafe condition for the admission of the public. And yet, the disaster had unfolded with such rapid force and the attempts at rescue had been so immediate and so clearly genuine that fixing blame on any individual or institution proved almost impossible. Who exactly was responsible for a frozen lake in a public park? The park's authorities had not encouraged people onto the ice. They had not sold tickets or charged admission. The lake had simply frozen, as it had done before, and the public had walked out onto it, as they had done before. But that answer sat uneasily with 40 coffins. If no one was responsible, how had it happened? The 14th of January had already demonstrated the ice was dangerous. People had fallen through, all had been rescued, and yet, nothing had been done to prevent the crowds from returning the next day in even greater numbers. No barriers had been erected. No warnings had been posted. No authority had stepped forward to say that the lake was closed, the ice was unsafe, and the risk was unacceptable. The weather had tempted. The ice had misled. The crowd had behaved as crowds inevitably do, and 40 people had paid the price. Responsibility was genuinely difficult to place on any single set of shoulders. But the uncomfortable truth was that warnings had existed and had not been acted upon. Complacency had dressed itself up as reassurance until it was too late. The disaster forced those responsible for Regent's Park to confront something they could not argue their way around. The lake itself had made the loss worse. In many places, the water had been deep enough that once a person slipped beneath the broken ice, reaching them quickly was almost possible. Rescue required extraordinary effort and still failed 40 times over. In the months that followed, the inquest's recommendations and the weight of public pressure led to practical change. The ornamental lake was partially drained and its bed reworked. Its depth was reduced in many areas to around 4 feet, so that if the surface ever failed again, a person might stand, or at the very least be reached and recovered far more easily. It was a quiet kind of change. Visitors in later years would see only a pleasant stretch of water, never realizing that its shape had been deliberately altered by the memory of what happened on the 15th of January, 1867. There was no plaque on the bank explaining this. No marker on the water's edge. The change was simply there, written into the landscape itself, an attempt to ensure that what happened that afternoon would never be repeated at the same terrible scale. The intention was not to make skating safe. No one could guarantee the safety of natural ice. It was to make catastrophe less final. And in that modest, practical ambition, the men who reshaped that lake understood something important. They could not control the cold, or the ice, or the pull of a crowd toward winter spectacle, but they could change the depth of the water beneath the danger, and in doing so, they could at least give the next person who fell through a fighting chance of surviving. It was a response paid for in grief, but it was a response. The men, women, and children who skated on Regent's Park Lake that January afternoon were not reckless. They were not foolish. They were doing what people had always done in hard winters. They were making use of what the season offered. They had watched others do it. They had done it themselves before. The ice had held yesterday, and the day before that, and in winters going back as far as they could remember. There was no reason, visible to the naked eye, to believe that today would be any different. Trust felt rational. That trust is not a weakness. It is one of the most fundamentally human things there is. We build our lives on the assumption that what held before will hold again, that the ground beneath our feet is the same ground it was yesterday, that the places we return to will remain what they were when we left them. Most of the time, that assumption is correct. Most of the time, the ice holds. But the 15th of January, 1867, showed what happens when that trust meets a surface that has been silently failing. The ice of Regent's Park Lake did not collapse without reason. It had been weakened the previous day. It was bearing more weight than it had ever been designed to carry. The warnings existed. They simply were not recognized as warnings or acted upon as such until it was too late. 40 people never went home from the park that afternoon. 39 drowned in water barely a kilometer from the streets where they lived. One did not survive the cold that settled into their body after they were pulled clear. They had trusted what they saw. They believed, as anyone might, that what held yesterday would hold again. The winter of 1867 never truly thawed for the families who lost someone on that lake, and for the people who stood on the banks and watched the ice give way, who thrust out branches and ropes in their own exhausted arms, who held faces above the water and sometimes could not hold them long enough. The memory of that afternoon and the sound of laughter turning to screaming in the space of a single, terrible second stayed with them for the rest of their lives. Naturally, this was a deeply distressing tragedy, and our condolences go out to the descendants of the 40 families who lost someone on the ice that day. I hope you liked the way the material was presented. I look forward to seeing you on the next one, and I will bid you goodbye for now.